Thursday. Happy Thursday, everybody. So for those of you who took the lab test on Tuesday, the highest grade was a 98. The average was an 83. So it's kind of what I anticipated. Yeah, the average was a B. A few people got lower than B, but most people got a B or an A. So great job on the lab test. Hopefully the group tonight will do even better. That'll be a challenge. Let's get higher than 83%. So like on Tuesday, my goal is to try to maybe finish a little early. I didn't do a good job on that on Tuesday, but tonight maybe I will, and so give you a little time to readjust and start thinking about lab stuff. Today's a big one. Today is an important lecture. I'm looking around and I don't see a lot of people here. It makes me a little worried. But today's a big one / tough one. So it's going to require a little bit of thinking. So I know it's hard to think about something when you have a test coming up, but try to do the best you can. We're going to get into bones today, and the way I attack bones in the skeletal system, it's the same way that I'm going to attack muscles. And I'm not going to stand up here and show you slides of bones, because that would be awfully boring. That's exactly what lab's all about. So lab, we will pick up bones and you will touch them and you will learn their names and things like that. That's what lab's about. In lecture today, we're going to start talking about bone physiology, which is a little different. Like, how does bone form? What's the difference between the bone in your skull versus the bone in your leg? And then tonight, at the end of lecture, we're going to talk about some bone abnormalities, some issues with bone. So that will be stage one of physiology of bone. Today's about bone formation. And then on Tuesday next week, we all talk about hormones. What? Hormones that regulate bone formation and calcium. So that's another kind of a tough one. So we will not spend any time talking about names of bones, and we'll do that to a very minimum. Okay, so let's get started today. Our first challenge with bone is to kind of review things that we learned about when we discussed connective tissue in lab. And we said that bone was a type of connective tissue. So when we think of connective tissue, one of the big categories or characteristics that you have in your table is that bone has a lot of non-living cellular debris in between the cells, or ground substance, if you remember that term. So when we think of bone, we're going to say that it's something that is very rigid, something that provides the opportunity for movement, because when we look at bones in lab, we're going to see that bones have lots of unusual bumps and crevices and holes. So there's places of attachment for muscles. We're also going to say that bone does a good job of regulating homeostasis, which is something we talked about, but we're going to be talking about maintaining different levels of calcium, even involved, if you can see on here, involved with acid and base production. And here's something that I think some of you knew, but it's also a place where blood is formed. So if you're thinking about getting a bone marrow transplant, what you're really doing is getting a fresh, new stock of stem cells from your bone that make blood. So, bone. One of the other things about bone that's kind of cool is that it's true about that maybe statement that you heard that the skeleton that's inside of you today is not the same skeleton that existed a year ago. So it's constantly remodeling itself. There's a phrase today that I think is really very important. And the phrase is, it's all about blood. So bone is really vascular, which means we have tons of blood going into and out of the bone. Tons of blood. Blood is also a major component in the development of bone, starting in our mom and how cells started to kind of form into bone-producing cells. Now when we look at bone, and we'll do this in lab, you can see that bone has a lot of different shapes and sizes, and you don't have to study any of this, and this is not worthy of a picture, but you can see that we have long bones and short and irregular bones, like the bones in our back. Our job today is to kind of talk about how bone is formed. And one of the things that you can see up on the big screen is that it kind of talks about the general formation of a bone. And so let's do a drawing. This is going to be a big drawing day. Okay? Oh, no, not really. Maybe I just have
Half picture, whole picture.
This is like 1/3 of the page. So we're going to draw a cartoon bone. And we're going to say that this is typical of all long bones. Long bones are in places like your arm and your legs. We're going to start off by saying that the ends of the bones are called the epiphyses. And we're going to say that the shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis. Okay, so those are kind of two terms that we'll need to think about for today's lectures. The shaft is the diaphysis, and the ends are the epiphyses. We're going to say that the outer covering of bone is something called the peri. That sounds familiar, right? Peri. Osteum. And what I would do is draw some arrows going like this. Not that it's like selectively permeable, but there's a lot of blood vessels going in and out of the bone. Remember, it's all about blood. Lots of blood vessels. On the ends of the bones, where we have the potential of interacting with other bones, we're going to call these joints. We'll spend an entire lecture talking about joints. We're going to find a slippery material called articular cartilage. If you want to think of it in maybe a practical way, for those of you who like chicken, sorry if you're a vegetarian, but if you're eating like a drumstick chicken and you gnaw all the way down to the bottom, you see that like little white shiny like bulb on the right? Well, that's articular cartilage. So articular cartilage, the purpose is that it allows for gliding and not grinding. So eventually we're going to talk about arthritis, and that's probably going to be something that we mention. The fact that this articular cartilage could be missing or breaking down. Now let's take this bone that we drew and let's make a longitudinal section. Let's slice it right down the middle. And what we're going to see when we look at the epiphyses is that inside there's a bunch of crisscrosses on both epiphyses. And we describe this type of bone appearance as being, ready, spongy. And we'll define spongy in a minute and talk about that. And then this might be kind of surprising to you, but in your femur, your leg bone, and in your arm bones, it's hollow. You might say, whoa, that doesn't sound like a good design. That sounds like it might crack. But we have a hollowed out portion called the medullary cavity. And this is a place that is in adults filled with fat. Interesting. in young people, it's another site of blood formation. Now, the type of bone that we find here and here, so not the spongy bone, but the bone that we find in this region, the diaphysis, this is called compact bone. And let's put a star by that, compact bone. Because it's a piece of compact bone that you have on your phone from lab. And I can't even remember if it was, and don't nod, because we're not supposed to talk about the test on Tuesday. But it may have been on the lab test, where you were supposed to identify what bone looked like. And when we look at compact bone underneath the microscope, if you guys remember from your picture on your phone, it kind of looked like this, a bunch of spots and kind of like concentric circles. And this was all colored in. This, what we're drawing, is the histology of compact bone. We call this whole thing an osteon. This dark thing is a canal. And again, where we're going to see lots and lots of blood. These dark things around it are called osteocytes, which is going to be a big topic for today, osteocytes. Those are the bone cells. Okay, so that's good. You should be able to redraw all of this on the next test. Everybody good with this?
No.
Okay. Any questions about the names or locations?
Time now.
Just take a picture of it, girlfriend.
I don't have time. Wait.
Your
You lose.
head's in the way.
That's
Yeah,
really
you
rude.
lose.
That's really rude.
Guess what I'll do that for you
That's
after?
the rudest.
Guess what, Hannah? I'm gonna raise it up after I go to practice.
I don't even like your drawings, it's not even.
So let's take a look. Here we go. Here is a long bone with spongy look. Here is the compact bone. Here's the periosteum. The articular cartilage, oh, they don't do a good job of that. They barely can see it on the ends here. The epiphyses in the spongy area. Here's the cavity. Okay, we're good. We know that. Then we said that inside the bone, we have the potential of having spongy. One of the interesting functions of spongy bone is that it's found in places where it's really supposed to be strong. So wherever there needs to be a lot of strength, or wherever there's potentially a lot of stress or force, we're going to find spongy bone. We'll talk about that in a minute. So here's an example of where we need strength. The bone that, ready, protects our heart. If you've ever seen the thickness of the real chest bone, the sternum, it's like this thick. And if I was like the grand designer of humans, man, it would have been like this thick, you know? Like, it would have been like a shield, you know? Or the same thing with your skull. I mean, the skull is protecting our brain. If I was like the designer of a human, it would be like a football helmet, you know? But it's not. It's a thin bone, but it has, look, a spongy middle and two compacts. I refer to this, and this might be something that help you remember this, I refer to this as a spongy bone sandwich. You know, think of it that way. Where would you find a spongy bone sandwich? You'd find it in places that need to be strong, be protective, yet not overbearing in terms of size. If our skull was really, really thick, like I would have designed it, we would have these gigantic muscles, and we would have, in our neck, we would look like some freak, right? All right, so spongy bone sandwich, found in places like flat bones, skull, sternum, a few others. This slide's really important. It's going to introduce us to some of the cells that we're going to be talking about today. And this gives you an idea of what we call a cell line. So if I ask you, hey, what's your lineage? Where'd you come from? Yeah, some of you say, oh, I'm German, whatever. But today I'm going to ask you, hey, where did that osteocyte come from? That little dark spot that we drew on the board or that you have on your phone. Where did the bone cell come from? Well, if we go back in time, it came from a stem cell called an osteogenic cell. So write that down. An osteogenic cell is a stem cell. It's a cell that can become one thing. So you might remember that as being a unipotent stem cell. And notice that if the stem cell differentiates, that's some lingo that we talked about. That's growing and becoming something new. If it differentiates into this cell, we call it an osteoblast. And that's going to be worthy of writing down. You have probably, I'm going to guess, 5 questions on the next exam dealing with osteoblasts. So you got to know what an osteoblast is. An osteoblast, and here's what I'm going to do, underline the B in blast. Osteoblasts are builders. So when you talk about bone remodeling, remember I said that skeleton that you have now is not what you had a year ago? How did you get the new skeleton? You had bone building. Thank you, osteoblasts. Okay, we'll talk all about that later. Osteoblasts, as they start building bone and laying down the ingredients to make stuff that gets really hard, bone, get trapped. They're still alive, but they're trapped and they're unable to build bone in other places. And once they become trapped, Brooke, they become an osteocyte. So an osteocyte really is a trapped osteoblast. So if I ask you to tell me where an osteocyte came from, you're going to say, well, it starts with these stem cells. They differentiate into osteoblasts. And as they start assembling all the ingredients to make bone, they get stuck and trapped. And we call those trapped osteoblasts osteocytes. Everybody good? That's the lineage of an osteoblast. Okay, it has a partner, and its partner is called an osteoclast. So let's write that one down. An osteoclasts are dissolvers. You might say, what? Why do we have dissolvers? Remember, bone remodeling, replacing, means that we have to remove sometimes old bone and replace it with new bone. Remember what I told you the topic for next Tuesday is? It has to do with hormones. Hormones. There's going to be hormones that regulate both of these players. It tells the bone cells to dissolve or tells the bone cells to build. That's a big topic. It's a whole lecture worthy of a topic. So let's take a look at the lineage of these stem cells. Here we have some stem cells. And notice that this diagram has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stem cells necessary to fuse together to make one osteodissolver, one osteoclast. So guess what the result is that we end up with one cell, remember this, that has more than one nucleus. Whoa. A cell that is multinucleated is created from more than one stem cell fusing together. So if you're on your A game and you think back to what we talked about with muscle, there was a type of muscle that we said was multinucleated, skeletal muscle. And if I would ask you on the exam, if I would just make up some Martian cell that has more than one nucleus, we should all be able now to give a guess or an explanation of how any cell ends up with more than one nucleus. It has to do with more than one stem cell necessary to create it. So it's kind of a neat piece of knowledge to know. There's not too many multinucleated cells in the human body, but now you know how they came into existence. Look what happens to an osteoclast. It also gets trapped, it doesn't change its name. And these osteoclasts are very potent. They have acid, believe it or not, within their cells that are involved with dissolving bone. And we'll talk about why you would want to dissolve in more detail on Tuesday. Okay, so now we have the two big players. These are antagonists of one another. They do the opposite. They keep each other in check. Stay with me. They are what creates homeostasis. If we need to build, what keeps us from building too much? Osteoclasts. If we need to dissolve, what keeps us from over-dissolving? Osteoblasts. So they work together. Now let me fast forward 3 lectures from today. Ready? We're going to talk about osteoporosis, something that happens to older men and women. And I'm going to tell you right now what causes osteoporosis. It's hyperactive growth, osteoclasts. So after menopause for some women, and as men get older, guess what? There's more dissolving than there is building. And the result is the bones get weaker. So we'll talk about that. That gives you an idea of why osteoblasts.
Is that like the same for teeth enamel?
No, it's completely different. Enamel is not bone. Enamel is a completely different substance. All right, let's talk about the ingredients to make bone. You do not have to listen. Do not study any of these names. Hydroxyapatite, calcium carbonate. You do not have to study any of that. What I want you to do on the test, and this is a promise, my promises are good, is that I want you to be able to tell me the recipe for making bone. Please don't use the word cup. Don't say 1/3 cup, 2/3 cup. But that's a way to remember it. It's 1/3 organic, 2/3 inorganic. So the organic material is what gives bone flexibility. Believe it or not, bone does have some give. The inorganic material is what makes it really, really strong. So it's a great combination, look, of strength and flexibility or resilience. Not to this extreme, but sometimes I say, okay, think about the last time you went fishing and you caught a big one. That pole bent all the way over and it didn't snap. It has strength and it has flexibility. Now our bones would never do anything like that, but it's the same kind of idea. So think about that. All right, let's get into spongy bone now and talk about kind of why it's spongy. We said spongy bone is found in the epiphyses. Spongy bone is found in places where there is flat bones, like the skull, the sternum, the scapula, if you know what that is, your shoulder blade. That's a skinny bone. There's lots and lots of canals or lots and lots of blood in the spongy bone. And it provides strength. So we said spongy bone is a structure that provides strength. Compact bone, on the other hand, is where we would find in the outside of bone lining the medullary cavity. It does not have spongy or holes. And we said that underneath the microscope, they're organized into osteons. So here's what it looks like. So you have this picture on your phone, I hope, and you should be able to redraw this now for the next lecture test. You should be able to say, okay, there's the canal, There are, oh, look at those dark spots. Those are osteocytes. Those are osteoblasts that got stuck in all of this stuff that they created. The non-living cellular debris. Oh, yes, connective tissue. It's all coming together. Here's another picture of what compact bone looks like, and you can see that those canals are truly blood canals. Not only do they go deep within the bone, but they also leak to the outside. And we said that the periosteum has blood going into and out of the bone. So here you can see the picture that's on your phone right here, and this is what it really looks like. Yeah, Justin.
So the previous slide, how many cells are actually there? Is there like a bunch of cells?
Oh my gosh, there's probably 100 just within this
Okay.
osteon. Yeah. Yeah, every dark spot is an osteocyte. And they're all alive. They're all alive. Take a look at this. This is a good picture of the hip joint. This is the end of the femur and its cup of the hip. And you can see at the epiphyses of the hip or the femur, it's very spongy. Lots of crisscrosses. So that means that this is a place that has the potential of having a lot of stress. You know, I am not a very, let's see, I cut grass, I weed whack, I chainsaw. So that makes me slightly manly, I think. But if you ask me like socket wrench, I might start sweating like, oh my gosh, I think I know what that is, you know? In other words, I'm not skilled in that area, but I appreciate people with those skills. We had a driveway replaced a few years ago, and our driveway had a curve in it. And so I enjoyed watching these guys pour concrete, you know, set up the forms, and then when the concrete was solidifying, they would make these lines in the concrete. You might see these in like a sidewalk. And if it's a big curve, they might even put more lines like this. And what these lines in the concrete do in your driveway or on a sidewalk is that they're called stress lines. They're saying that we anticipate stress on this concrete. So to prevent it from cracking, we're going to have these lines to alleviate the stress. So if you think this is impressive on a curve in a driveway, then what if we change this into the femur and we went like this? I mean, what? I mean, we have all of this. This is an incredible design. These are stress lines. This says that when you run and when you jump and when you go up and down stairs, there's a lot of pressure on this bone and it's not going to crack. That's sweet. Unless you have issues where, look, you have osteoclasts starting to dissolve and you start having osteoporosis. You make the bone weaker, then you can have hip fractures, which is big business, by the way, if you're an orthopedic surgeon, right? So here are some of the general stress lines that you see, and this is where bone would want to crack on a daily basis. But thankfully, we have spongy bones, so we're good. So now you say, oh, that's pretty neat. I didn't know that. I know now why we have this design in bones. Yeah, man.
What would our weakest bone be?
Oh, that is a really good question. I'm gonna have to think about that one for a minute. Yeah, clavicle's not very impressive. Yeah, I'm gonna say fibula. I'm gonna say the small bone in the back of your calf. That's my guess. That'd be my vote for the weakest bone in the body. But somebody, I'm sure, is gonna Google that and say, Mike, you're wrong. But I'm going with that. I'm going heavy. I'm betting heavy. Fibula.
Are the stress
Not really.
lines like developed or they just stay like, you know what I'm saying? Like
Say that again. Start over.
the stress lines.
Yeah.
Like,
Are they modifiable? Do they change, are you saying?
Yeah, like
So
if you're
someone
like
who's
an athlete,
bedridden probably doesn't have very impressive stress lines. Someone who's like, you know, those crazy dudes, and maybe women too, that do that parkour thing where they jump like off buildings and they bounce and they jump, and they put all kind of, I bet you their stress lines are unbelievable. I bet their spongy bone's really tight.
What about infants as they get older, because they don't move that much?
Yeah,
And their
I would
bones are
say that
super
there's a good,
flexible.
I would say that there's a good foundation, but it probably increases with age. Rick?
Lacrimal is the weakest bone.
The lacrimal bone? Okay, so that's the bone right here in the corner of your eye. That says that's the weakest bone?
Yes.
Oh, Rick,
According to you.
I didn't do it.
according to Google? Nice. I'm still going with fibula.
The internet.
I'm doubling down. Google's wrong. I bow down to Google. I say whatever. All right. Let's talk about the medullary cavity, that hollow region in the bone. I said that in an adult it's fatty, but in young people it's full of red blood. This is a term that you're going to learn about next semester called hemopoiesis, which is the official name for blood production. But look at this. This is disgusting. It says that when we get old, that the marrow in our bones that is not red like a young kid. It's not yellow like it is in you, and I'll even throw me into that group. But when I get really old, it turns into what? Reddish jelly. I don't even know what that means. That almost makes me gag. It's like Mary telling me she likes to smell armpits. Mary, I'll never forget that. Mary, I'll never forget that. That was the first thing I told my wife when I got married. I swear to you, it's the first thing I said. You are not going to believe this. Yeah, wife. Mary. Mary.
Me and Mike.
Mary, I'll probably bring that up every lecture. Yes, Sierra.
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 Yeah, she's Sierra.
Sorry, Sierra.
So, I have a good question. So, my mom, she did a bone marrow transplant.
Oh, that's a good question.
So, how long can bone marrow survive being outside of the
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I know that answer. Usually the person who's donating bone marrow is in probably the room next door. So it's probably like boom, boom. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So, have you ever like eaten bone marrow before?
Oh, yes, of
Okay.
course. Yeah.
Well, so I have two, but I was curious if if they would cut the bone, if it's already gelatinous, or if you have to cook it for the gelatinous stuff to come
Yeah,
out. Or...
so when my wife makes like beef vegetable soup, like in the fall, and see, I'm starting to squirt spit thinking about it. But when I think of like a perfect Saturday in the fall, I'm thinking cold weather, watching football, and a big old bowl of beef vegetable soup. My wife will say, Mike, you need to go to Kroger and get a beef bone. And in the middle of the bone, that they cut at Kroger, it looks bright yellow.
Okay. Yeah, because
That's
we
the
scoop
fat.
it out and we put it on cracker and you eat it.
You see
Oh, now that's weird.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh my gosh, you go ahead and sit next to Mary.
It tastes really good.
Well, yeah,
But
it's
it has like
hard.
a gelatinous consistency.
Yeah, yeah. I've never heard of that one either. Man, this, really, what's it called?
Yeah,
Rick, what's it called? Ostal Boodle?
If you go to the Purple Pig in Chicago, they serve it, so.
They serve at the Senate downtown there too.
Oh, yeah, they do.
That's out of my pay range.
They got a little crostini.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
What you
delicious.
know about crostini?
Just send me to Cracker Barrel. All right, let's move on. Let's move on. See, Taylor, I know, me and you, Cracker Barrel. All right, so let's talk about something tricky. We're gonna talk about two processes in the next 15 minutes. And students hate these two processes. So there will be probably 5 or 6 questions total over these two processes. I want you to be able to compare and contrast. I'm going to explain them like a story. I'm not going to say that there are steps. Don't look at this and say, oh, Mike, I need to study 4 steps. I'm not into steps. I'm just into whether or not you can explain the process. So I'm going to do it twice. Here's what I want you to do. I don't want you to take any notes. I just want you to listen. It's story time. Then the second time, I want you to take notes and maybe it'll make sense. This is a story on how, ready, a spongy bone sandwich is made. So this is how flat bone is made. I'm talking about in the womb. So it begins with a bunch of embryonic tissue. That's pretty vague, but it involves embryonic tissue, and it is congregating around blood. Blood is one of the first things that is developed in a developing fetus. So you can see up here that we have tissue kind of in layers, and it has everything to do with blood. Now the blood is what delivers all of the ingredients and the players. So wherever there is blood, it is very valuable to the bone. So blood is going to bring stem cells that differentiate into osteobuilders and osteodissolvers. Okay, let's move over to this one. So here you can see a drastic change, but really what you see is now osteoblasts doing their thing. They are now free to assemble the 1/3 cup and 2/3 cup. And as they do that, some of them, look, poor things, are getting stranded, like that one up there. He's stuck. So he'll become an osteocyte. But the osteodissolvers do something very important. I want you to listen to this. Is that they make sure that the blood never gets covered up. Because the blood is what's delivering the gold, right, the money. So we don't want to have bone covering up any of the blood vessels. Okay, so that brings us to this. Look at this. So now we have osteocytes, that's what all these little specks are. And we have big open spaces because the osteoclast saying, I am not going to allow you to cover up blood. And we end up with a region that looks kind of spongy. But notice the ends. There is no blood. So the osteocytes, like we see up here, look, get stuck and they form compact bone. That's it. So we have compact bone because there's no blood in that region. We have spongy bone in the epiphyses because we have tons of blood. Tons of blood. Remember, it's all about blood. That's our theme for today. Okay, let's do it again. Take some notes.
Good question.
Yeah.
Do osteocytes have any function once they're trapped, or are they just kind of?
They're just maintaining. So they're maintaining. So they really don't do much except they keep the bone alive. So there's blood still going to them. They're still catabolizing and doing what cells do, but they're not active anymore. Okay, so let's begin with the process of making spongy bone sandwiches, which are flat bones, like the skull and your sternum and the scapula. We're going to say it begins with embryonic tissue congregating around blood. This is what happens in the womb. Embryonic tissue congregates around blood. Blood is what's delivering all of the necessary ingredients. Not only the ingredients to build the 1/3 cup and the 2/3 cup, but also those stem cells that have the potential of becoming osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So blood is delivering the goods. Then we see that once blood delivers the goods, the cells can be free to do what they're supposed to do. That is, build and dissolve. And as some of the builders, the osteoblasts, get stuck, they become osteocytes. And as some of the material that's being made gets dissolved because it's surrounding a blood vessel. And you can say in your notes that this is the explanation of spongy bone. It's many blood vessels being protected, if you want to think of it that way, uncovered by osteoclasts. So that's an important concept. So what we end up with is a piece of bone that has 2 or 3 different kind of layers, a top layer of spongy, a top layer of compact, a middle layer of spongy, and a bottom layer of compact. And it has everything to do with blood. Okay, now there's not many examples of flat bones. So we call this type of bone formation, here's the big topic, and underline this in your notes, we call this intramembranous ossification. That is something that's worthy of circling and starring and remembering. Flat bone formation is described as intramembranous. Okay. The second type of bone formation, which you're going to compare and contrast to, is something called endochondral ossification. So let's stop and just say the word ossification means that it's bone formation, bone hardening. Ossification means bone formation. So the word chondral, you might remember, has to deal with cartilage. Like the cartilage cells called a chondrocyte. So this is the way most bone forms in our body. It originates from cartilage. Okay, so put down your pencil and pen. Let me talk about this process, and then I'll give you a chance to take notes. I'm going to call this color, whatever this is, light blue, I'm going to call this color virgin cartilage, untouched cartilage, embryonic cartilage, whatever you want to say. And it starts with the kind of invasion of this cartilage region with blood. Yeah, it's all about blood. So blood does what? It delivers the goods. It sounds familiar. It delivers osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Well, once it starts delivering the goods, guess what happens? We start building bone, but we don't build it here in the middle. Holy cow, look at that blood vessel right there. We're not covering that up. And you'll notice that we also have blood entering in the epiphyses as well. And we're not going to cover that blood up because that's really important. So you can jump ahead and see that the reason why we have spongy bone in the epiphyses is because there's a lot of blood vessels there. The reason why we have this gigantic cavity is because this is where the blood entered originally. Everybody says it makes sense, right? So wherever there's blood, osteoclasts are going to prevent bone from being there. But there's no bone, there's no blood on the ends except for a few places, so it forms compact. And there's no bone, there's no sponginess in the compact region because of the stress. Most of the stress are on the ends. So we have stress or spongy bone on both ends, the epiphyses. So we can say that we go from cartilage to bone because of what blood brings to the table. It brings all the ingredients. Now there's a couple words here that are really important. Let me explain them, and then I'll let us go back and we can take notes. One of the words that I have not mentioned before is a word called metaphysis. That is a fancy word for transition, the transition zone from cartilage to bone. Because that's got to happen, right? We're changing cartilage into bone. You also see a couple weird things in the epiphysis. One is called an epiphyseal plate, and then you see an epiphyseal line. And we'll explain the difference between those two in a minute. Okay, let's go back and take notes. So this process is called endochondral ossification, which means we're forming bone using cartilage as our starting point. So cartilage, hyaline cartilage, if you remember that from lab, is used and blood invades. Blood creates this cavity and delivers osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and the 1/3 and 2/3 cups. So So all the ingredients, just like in the last situation. But blood also penetrates both ends, the epiphyses. So what we see is that we have bone formation beginning at the epiphyses and in the medullary cavity. So we have what we call a primary ossification center. That's where the blood first entered. And then we have secondary down here and up here where blood is entering at the ends. So we have two places where blood is starting the process. The first place is called primary. There's two second places, right, at the ends. Those are called secondary ossification centers. So the process of changing cartilage into bone is kind of a complex idea. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see that the colors are changing from this virgin color, look, tell me what this color is, purple, to this purple lavender color. We're gonna say lavender is somewhere in between cartilage and bone. And notice that when the bone is almost finished growing lengthwise, we have, look, only one strip of hyaline virgin cartilage surrounded by, look, lavender and lavender. And everybody get this. It means that the bone cells are moving down and up and meeting somewhere here in the middle. This is called the epiphyseal plate. And write this in your notes. A lot of people call this your growth plate. If you if you x-ray any small child, you will see that in the ends of their bones, there will be a gap, an empty space, because hyaline cartilage does not show up on x-ray. You can identify if your kid is still growing or not. Notice on the right-hand side, you have an adult bone, and there is no virgin cartilage. In fact, there is no even lavender color. You just see a line where they both kind of met and fused together. If you have an epiphyseal line, you're done growing. No doubt about it. All of us in this room probably have an epiphyseal line. Let me tell you a story about this that I always think about when I teach this. My daughter, as I said, was a big basketball player all through high school and since 5th grade. And in 5th grade, she was like the tallest on the team, and she was super aggressive, and she was pretty good, I thought. And she was playing just like rec basketball. And so the following year, I maybe did something dumb, but in 6th grade, she started playing AAU basketball, which is year-round basketball, crazy basketball, like traveling and basketball practices all the time. After her first year of AAU, this coach called us and said, hey, we would really like to have Gabby on our team. And this coach was the coach of like the best team in the city. So it was like, whoa, my daughter's getting recruited and she's in the 6th grade. This is pretty sweet. So I was asking questions like how much, where do you practice, how many tournaments, all these crazy questions. And I thought, okay, this sounds like potentially a good idea. And then this psycho coach said to me, remember my daughter's in 6th grade, she said to me, hey, when's the last time you had Gabby x-rayed? I said, what are you talking about? She said, we only want Gabby if she's still growing. She wanted proof that my daughter still had an epiphyseal plate. And then I said, see you later. You know, like that's crazy. You're having parents x-ray kids to see if they're still growing? Now, how crazy is that? My son, who was a junior last year, tore his labrum. Don't ask me how. He was forming a pyramid during powder puff football game. Instead of being the football player, he was like a cheerleader and he was like at the base. And everybody collapsed on him. So he tore his labrum, he was out the whole year. So the cool thing about that, which there wasn't many things cool about it, is that when he got x-rayed to see if his labrum was healed, it said in the bottom right-hand corner of his x-ray, epiphyseal plate open. I thought that was pretty cool. I said, Josh, dude, you're still growing. how do you know, Dad? You know? I said, well, look, it says this right here, epiphyseal plate open. That's pretty sweet, I thought, you know? Yeah,
My husband got x-rayed as a child, and my in-laws swear this, so, you know, grain of salt with
Yeah.
stories, but, at like 14, 15 x-ray, and a doctor looked at them and said, it's gonna be about 6'8", because he was already a really tall kid, and
Yeah.
I guess probably still had a decent sized plate or whatever.
yeah,
And he's exactly 6'8".
wow.
So they swear by that, they're like,
That's
oh,
amazing. Yeah, some of you probably played sports, especially like soccer, and were always concerned about like damaging your ankles, especially during that growth plate era. So now you know really what it is.
So height, like this, none of this is based off of like testosterone or like.
No, testosterone has no effect. Well, testosterone can cause bones to become thicker. It's not gonna cause you to become taller.
Right.
So your bones will become bigger, and you might become bigger, but you're not gonna grow taller.
So
Okay.
they-
That was
Maybe,
talking about my brother, he
maybe
gets taller.
human growth, listen, maybe HGH could do that, but not testosterone. Yeah?
I was gonna ask about HGH, like effects.
Yeah, so HGH, that's human growth hormone, that's what's secreted during puberty, that could have an influence. So if I was really hardcore and like with my daughter, you know, right now in my anatomy lab at Xavier, I have a growth at 6'4". That's sweet, you know? I should show a picture, I had a picture taken with her. I mean, she is like way up there.
She's in the
And
basketball.
I said to her, oh yeah, she's on team. And I said to her, man, I wish my daughter was this tall. And then I told my daughter about it. She said, Dad, no way. I'm happy at 5'11", you know? So anyway, let's talk a little bit about this process. Again, when we look at the steps, remember I'm not gonna ask you about steps. Do not study steps. Do not memorize steps or any numbers. Just be able to explain the process. Make sure that you understand the difference between a plate and a line. And know what the metaphysis is. Remember, that's the area of transition. Now this one, I don't think I've said this today. I think this might be worthy of a picture. So whip out your phone. Take a picture of this. This is a close-up of the metaphysis. And I would say what would you say around here? About 10 people are absent today? This is a small group. Pretty empty. This is a bad lecture to miss. So what I want you to do on the exam, and I'll tell you for a fact that this is a test question, is that you have not to draw this or anything, but you have to explain the layers of the metaphysis. So we're going to go through them. That's why you don't have to write this down, because you just took a picture of it, right? So the first zone, which is, I'm going to say, the color of virgin cartilage, is called the zone of reserve cartilage. Or you could say, don't write the word virgin
I
on
was
this.
gonna say, what-
Don't write the word, just say embryonic. It's still fetal worthy. But look at zone 2. It says that the cartilage is starting to divide like crazy. That's the definition of proliferation. So that means that the cells are changing, they're growing. Zone 3 says, look at this. Now the cells are starting to get bigger. Remember what I said? I think this was, last class, maybe 2 classes ago? I said hypertrophy means that cells are getting bigger, but you're not making more of them. I used the example of bodybuilding is making skeletal muscles bigger, but you're not making more of them. So here we have, look right here, everybody. We have cartilage cells not making more, like we see here, but they're puffing up. They're getting bigger, hypertrophy. Then, look at zone 4. It says they become crusty. What? How do they become crusty? They become calcified. Well, that's big, because calcium is one of the ingredients that osteoblasts need. So they get old and calcified. And then zone 5 says, this is the destruction of a old, worn out chondrocyte or cartilage cell. And it's the use of that material to build bone. So we have zone of bone formation. So when you look at the two different colors up here, you can say, okay, this light blue means that it's the original cartilage, but this lavender color means that we're changing. We're either dividing like crazy, we're either puffing up, we're becoming old and crusty, or we're becoming bone. So that's the transition that we see between cartilage and bone. All together, all of this, it's called the metaphysis. So just remember that. Okay. Here's a picture of a fetal skeleton in 12 weeks, and you might say, whoa, what's up with the hands? What's up with the bones? There's still cartilage, right? There's still cartilage. So cartilage doesn't show up on x-ray. Look at this kid's hand right here. If you squint in every end of every bone, look at this. Even that one, you can see an epiphyseal plate. So when you take your kid to the doctor and they get an x-ray because they broke a bone, you know, the doctor's going to say, well, look, Johnny, the bone is healed. But you're going to look up here and say, whoa, look at that plate. You know, nothing but hyaline cartilage. Nothing but hyaline cartilage.
So is it more prone to compound fractures in that area?
Yes, that's why soccer players are kind of worried about that because of the stress on the ankle, the lower part, the epiphyses of the lower leg. Okay, 2 more slides and then we're going to call it a day. I think we're doing good today. I might actually finish early like I promised. I want you to write down this or circle this law. It says that there is a law that determines how fast bone is built and how fast bone is absorbed. It's called Wolff's Law, and it has everything to do with stress. Because up on top it says bone will increase in length until there is a line. But bone will also have a limit in width. But what causes this to take place and what causes the remodeling to take place? It has everything to do with physical stress. Now this should make complete sense to some of you. Some of you have been in a cast for like 3 months, or you know a friend, and when they took off the cast of their arm looked puny. Like, whoa, what the heck? You know? Or you look at the legs of someone who is wheelchair. What is it? Ridden? Wheelchair bound for like the rest of their life. Their legs are scrawny. Or bedridden, right? They are scrawny because they cannot put physical stress. I also want you to think of this and never ever make fun of a mall walker. You know, those old people that wear those big white leather New Balance shoes. No one's going to make fun of them because what they're doing is they're putting physical stress on their bones. Their doctor probably said something like, oh, have you gone through menopause? What about your bone density? Which means, are you making bigger holes now because of your osteoclast? Well, the way we can counter that is to cause more stress. Just like my friend Vince said, just like my friend Dominic said, he said that if you are more active, you're going to put more stress lines and make your legs stronger. So stress, walking can do a whole lot for bones. Yeah.
So how does bone extension work then?
Extension?
You ever heard of that?
Tell me.
So I've seen it like.
Just tell me what it is.
It's
See,
basically
it's
where
like
they
hyperextension?
No, like where they artificially lengthen a bone.
Yeah, they like break it and they put like pins in
And
it.
they put like an artificial cartilage or something.
I have no idea.
They used to be like in China, they used to do it to make the linen. Sometimes they make them shorter too. But they like break it and like move it to make you either taller or shorter.
Let's all move to China.
Your daughter
Move it here?
6'4".
If you have like an unbalanced leg or something?
I heard that. My mom
I don't
watches
know
medical
about
shows
that.
all the time, so she was watching it and
I don't
they
know,
were
I've never heard of
lengthening somebody's.
Yeah, if there's a problem where one leg is shorter than the other, then I think that's a great idea. But just to do it for one leg.
I got a question about the stress thing. Like,
Oh,
like, you know how they say like running on concrete isn't good for you, like for your legs and stuff?
Well, I'll say that running on concrete is not good if you do it all the time. So if you're a runner, you should run on concrete, and then you should run on like blacktop, you should run on different surfaces, that's the best. You should never run on the same surface all the time. Take a look at this. This is an example of abnormal bone growth. That's been the topic today, right? Ossification. I think all of you should look at this word and say, I'm not scared of this word. A means, listen, A means without. Chondro means cartilage. And we all know what plasticity means. Plastic means the ability to change. So this type of dwarfism says, oh, they are unable to change cartilage into bone, which is the whole topic of today's lecture, right? Endochondral ossification, they can't do it. So this is a problem, and this results in bone not changing in shape. Or sometimes the lack of growth can be because of a lack of HGH, human growth hormone. So it's a hormonal or it's a more of a mutation, which is kind of interesting. I had someone in last fall here at Cincinnati State who was achondroplastic. Jake, I don't know if you've seen him on good guy. Here's an example of the other extreme where we have too much bone growth. And all I want you to write down are the letters FOP. You do not have to tell me what it stands for, but it will be on the test because I'm going to show you a video of this. And it's an example of a very, very rare disease where we have accelerated bone growth. Watch this.
Introducing new Metamucil Premium Blend. Sweetened with stevia and made with all natural flavors and colors. It's a delicious way to get your daily dose of fiber. And try Metamucil Fiber Drink. A great tasting and easy way to start your day.
Welcome to 2015.
These people live with a mysterious condition with no known cure, called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, or FOP.
FOP is one of the rarest conditions known to mankind. You need to fill 20 stadiums in order to find one person who has FOP.
Oh, sorry.
In the United States, there are fewer than 300 confirmed cases. It's an extraordinary condition that causes bone to grow unchecked where it shouldn't. At any moment, with the slightest trauma, even a simple bruise, muscles, tendons, and ligaments can turn to bone. Joints can fuse, threatening to imprison patients in a second skeleton. And once the new bone forms, it's there to stay.
FOP is a worse form of unwanted bone formation known to mankind.
It's also a metamorphosis unique in human biology.
Listen.
The only case known to medical science of one organ turning into another.
In the body, the heart doesn't become the lungs, the liver doesn't become the kidneys, but in FOP, the muscles, tendons, and ligaments become a second skeleton.
Good, so you're
At first glance, 28-year-old Holly Polano appears to suffer from a particularly severe case of arthritis. But she's been living with FOP since the age of 16.
I live with FOP every day of my life. The scariest thing about FOP is that it's permanent.
I'd like to take a
Look at
look
this
now
poor
at
thing.
the range of motion in your neck, and I'd like you to look down for me.
That's as far as she can go.
Thank you. Can you look up? Okay, so that's about 15% of normal.
Over the 12 years that I've been living with FOP, it's affected numerous areas of my body, including my neck,
Look at this new bone.
my back, both of my arms,
Look at that.
my shoulders.
Look at that.
Her doctor, Frederick Kaplan, is the leading expert on FOP, having examined virtually every patient worldwide.
Maybe take a look at your back.
Sure.
Patients like Holly can experience new bone growth at any time. The first signs are painful swellings called flare-ups.
I see here some areas of old bone formation, but they look old. They don't look like new flare-ups at all.
Since muscles develop micro tears when they are pushed beyond normal use, something as innocuous as basic exercise could trigger a flare-up, or something as severe as a fracture. Basically, anything that results in inflammation, the body's response to physical trauma, could be the beginning of new bone growth.
If I have a flare-up, which could be caused by a simple thing such as bumping into something, I'm faced with the fear of knowing that that joint or that organ can lock up forever.
When a healthy person experiences trauma like a bruise, the immune system kicks into gear. Immune system cells flock to the site of the injury. They consume damaged tissue and repair it. But when people like Holly experience the same injury to their muscles, tendons, or other tissue, these cells cannibalize the body. They ravage both damaged and healthy tissue in the trauma region. In the wasteland of dead tissue, a few living cells remain. They are stem cells, cells able to transform themselves into different types of tissue. While in an ordinary human, they would form into scar tissue or replacement tissue.
Listen.
In FOP patients, they morph into cartilage and then bone.
Then bone.
Eventually, ribbons and sheets and plates of bone replace the body's skeletal muscles, cross the joints, lock them in place, and render movement completely impossible.
All right, on that uplifting note, we'll end the class.
Did it just happen for no reason? Like,
Yes.
if you don't have an injury, you
Yes.
Is it because they're osteogenic stem cells?
It could be, probably.
They can only do